Hey, can you see people coming on?
Yes.
I can't. Right there,
Yes.
30 of them. Okay.
Yeah, it looks like we have a good number of attendees. So everybody, welcome. We will get things going here in about another minute or so. All right, it is 11 o'clock, so we'll get this thing going. Welcome to Virtual Conservation Live with the Tippecanoe County Partnership for Water Quality. My name is Ben. You also see Monica on your screen from the Tippecanoe County Partnership for Water Quality. This event is taking place of the Conservation Field Day that we normally hold for Tippecanoe County fourth graders every year, where we do live topics on natural resources subjects at Martell Forest, owned by Purdue. But because of the coronavirus, we're unable to do that in person, so we figured we would take it virtual. So thank you all for being here. We have an excellent presentation today from Wildlife Extension Specialist Jared Brooke. He's going to tell us about prescribed fire. But before I turn it over to Jared, a little housekeeping on how this might work. There is a Q&A box that you can type questions into. Monica and I will pose those questions to Jared when there's an opportunity to do so. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat box or in the Q&A box. Jared will be showing some videos, some pictures, things like that. So please give Jared your attention, and then we will give Jared our questions. But I want to say welcome. Thank you for coming to Virtual Conservation Live. Okay, Jared, take it away.
All right, thanks Ben, and thanks Monica for having me. Like Ben said, I'm an extension wildlife specialist with Purdue's Forestry and Natural Resources Department. What that is that's a long way of saying that I'm a wildlife biologist. And so as a wildlife biologist, what I spend a lot of my time doing is doing educational events like this for kids, but I also work a lot with landowners. And the landowners I work with, I try to help them create a better home for wildlife on their property. So I'm gonna, as we go through this, feel free to type your questions in there, but I'm going to be asking questions to you as well. And so you can try to type your answers in the question and answer, or you can just talk with your parents or whoever you're with and maybe answer the questions to them. So the first question I have for you is, I just said that I help landowners create a better home for wildlife. So what do we call a place where wildlife live? Again, any answers in the chat box, maybe?
I haven't seen any yet, but if you have an answer to that question, feel free to put it in the Q&A box.
All right. Well,
Can you say it one more time, Jared, please?
Yeah. So what do we call a place where an animal lives?
I got it.
What do we call its home? We got an answer?
We got a few answers. One of the ones that I'm seeing right now, Josie H says habitat.
Man, someone even said it in all caps. So you're right, habitat, right? We don't call it a condo or an apartment like where we live, but it's their habitat. And habitat is 4 things. And those 4 things are the same 4 things that we need. Those 4 things are food, water, cover or shelter, and space. So just like we need all those things, wildlife need all those things. And we can do things to create better habitat for wildlife. And one of those things that we can do is prescribe fire. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. We're going to talk about the benefits and the good side of fire when you may have heard, maybe bad things about fire. So one of the things I want to start out with, I'm going to try to share my screen, and bear with us as we're all learning how to use this technology. Let's see here. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to show you some videos and some pictures and things. Well, we're going to start with a picture. And I want you, can everyone see this picture now? I should have covered up his hat, but can anyone tell me who that is right there? Has anyone seen that character there?
Go ahead and type it in the chat box if you remember. Yep.
You getting answers? All right.
We're getting answers.
It's not Yogi Bear. That's Smokey Bear. So Smokey Bear is actually older. He's older than me. He's probably older than your parents, and he may be older than some of your grandparents. So Smokey the Bear has been around since the 1940s when he came out, and he has a message. Can anyone type in the chat box what Smokey the Bear's message is? You getting some answers in there?
A couple of only yous. No one has the full statement, but
No one's got
a lot of
the full-
only yous.
Yeah.
Only you can prevent
Yep.
full forest
Start a
fires.
fire.
There we
Even
go.
Reeves
So,
knows it.
yeah, his saying is only you can prevent forest fires. And what Smokey the Bear is talking about there is he's talking about wildfires. So when we talk about wildfires are fires that usually start by accident. They may be started by lightning and other things, but they're fires that we can't really control and may be dangerous to people or people's homes or businesses or things like that. And so Smokey has a really good message in that we want to really prevent forest fires or wildfires from occurring. On the other side of that is what we're going to talk about, which is prescribed fire. Anyone think they can tell me what the difference between wildfire and prescribed fire are? Got some answers in there? Everyone?
A lot of I don't knows.
I don't know.
Nothing
Oh, great. Well, that's what we're here to talk about. So I want you to take the two words that are in there, prescribed and fire. And so prescribed can also be interchanged with controlled. So a lot of times if you go to the doctor, you get a prescription to help you feel better, maybe give you some medicine and things like that. So prescribed fire is essentially a way that we can create healthy ecosystems or healthy forests by using fire in a controlled way. So we light a fire and we control it and burn only where we want to burn. So we're not endangering people or buildings or wildlife or things like that, but we do it to create healthy forests and healthy ecosystems. So it's controlled rather than uncontrolled, like a wildfire. And you may be asking yourself, well, why do we need to burn the forest? Well, there's a lot of different plant species that are adapted to fire. Just like wildlife and plants have adaptations to various things, a lot of plants have adaptations to fire. And one of the really cool ones is this. So this right here, these are pine cones from lodgepole pines, which lodgepole pines are probably the most common pine tree you would see at Yellowstone National Park. Can anyone tell me what the difference is between the pine cone on the left, this one over here, and this one over here, and the one on the right?
We'll just say the left is closed, so it doesn't burn.
So the left one is closed. The left one's closed, and the right one's
The
open.
one on the left is closed, yeah.
Yep. And so the left one is closed, the right one is opened. But what's really interesting is how the one on the right opens. So these pine cones are what's called serotinous. That's a really big word, but what it means is that in order for this pine cone to open, to drop its seeds, it has to be exposed to really high temperatures. And so these high temperatures come usually from fire. So these cones only open up when a fire has gone through the forest. So this tree is only able to reproduce after a fire has burned through the forest. So what it does is there's pine resin in this pine cone. The resin is the sticky stuff you get on your hand when you touch a Christmas tree or things like that. That pine resin breaks down with high heat, and then the pine cone opens. So I'm going to show you a little video about how this works. Can you see my video now?
Yep.
All right, and so what we have here is we have one of those lodgepole pine cones that's in an oven, and you can watch the temperature as it increases and watch what happens to the pine cone. So you can see as the temperature gets warmer, we're at 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Now we're at 200, 250, 300, 350, all the way up to 400 degrees. That pine cone starts to open up. And now we're almost at 425 degrees, and that pine cone has opened up. We'll speed up the video a little bit. You come here, you're going to take the pine cone out. So there's the cone before it was put in under high heat. And there's the cone after. And now he shakes it out, and there's all the seeds from that pine cone. So that's one of the adaptations that plants have to fire. That's from a pine cone. This is another pine cone. This one's called a jack pine. We don't have jack pines here in Indiana, but they have jack pines in Michigan and Minnesota, New York, some places like that. The cone on the bottom is a cone that hasn't been burned or hasn't been heated. The cone on the top is a cone that has been heated or been through a fire. So it needs the fire to open it up. And you have the same thing with giant sequoia trees that you would see out in California and the Pacific Northwest. So they're some of the biggest trees on the planet, but they also need fire in order to open their pine cones to reproduce. Now, if we bring it closer home to Indiana, this picture here is a really cool picture from National Geographic. What it shows is it shows prairie vegetation. So some prairie grasses, some wildflowers. And if you know anything about Indiana, especially the northwest part of Indiana, there used to be large expanses of prairie in this area. And what prairie is it's a grassland vegetation. So it's grasses and wildflowers and things. But these plants are also really adapted to fire. They're also adapted to things like drought and grazing by things like bison. Some of those adaptations that they have is they have a really long root system, which helps them get water when it's dry, but also helps them re-sprout after they've been burned and re-sprout after they've been grazed. And so when a fire goes through the prairie and burns all this vegetation that's on top of the ground, those plants are able to re-sprout from the root system. So right here in Indiana, we have a lot of plants that are adapted to fire. And so some of the trees that we have in Indiana that are adapted to fire are things like oak trees. So we think of oak trees, one that we have around this area, a couple actually, are white oak and bur oak. They have really thick bark, and that bark helps those trees stay cool when a fire goes through the forest. So it helps protect the growing tissue in the fire, or in the plant, in the tree, from the heat of the fire. But what they also can do is they can heal themselves if they get damaged or injured by a fire. So we can use this really cool thing where we look at the tree rings on a tree and we can almost tell when fires happened. So if you know anything about trees, you know you can count the tree's age by looking at their rings, but we can also see things like these fire scars here. So these are times when that tree was growing, when they were damaged by fire. It didn't kill the tree, but they were damaged and it was able to heal itself. And so we can use this, look at this, and we can go back in time to know when fires occurred throughout history. So here's another picture of this is a post oak, which is another kind of oak that we have in southern Indiana, but this is actually a picture of a tree from Kentucky. And each one of these little lines in here shows you a time when a fire might have occurred and damaged that tree. So the thick bark helps prevent them from dying from the fire or being injured, but if they do get injured, they're able to heal themselves. So really cool ways that plants are adapted to fire, and they need fire in order to help grow. So we think to Indiana, and we think more about how maybe some of our ecosystems are adapted to fire, plants are adapted to fire. This is a picture from up by Lake Michigan, up by the Dunes National Park. And so this is a picture of what we would call a pine savanna. So a oak savanna. An oak savanna is different from a forest in that the trees you can see here are really spaced out, really far away. There's lots of green growing vegetation, grasses and things like that underneath. So we would have had, anywhere you see yellow is where we would have had oak savannas across kind of the central United States into Indiana and even in here to Michigan. If you take a closer look at Lake Michigan, anywhere you see this kind of greenish vegetation here, we would have had oak savannas up by Lake Michigan. We would have had oak savannas here in Tippecanoe County. We would have oak savannas even farther west into Warren County and north into Jasper County. But these are maintained by fire. So fire kind of promotes the species that are in there, like some of the oak species and some of the grasses and forbs you see. But these are some of the ecosystems that we have in Indiana that are adapted to fire. We also have lots of prairie in Indiana, especially the northwest part of the state. And this picture is taken from Kankakee Sands, which is up in Newton County, a little bit north of here. But this is a picture of a prairie. So a prairie is just kind of that vegetation that's dominated by grasses and forbs, really open. But as we saw earlier, a lot of these plants out here have really long root systems and are adapted to fire. We have a lot of ecosystems in Indiana. One of the biggest ones being our oak hickory forests. So here, this tree right here is a white oak. This tree is adapted to fire. And this stand of trees has been burned, but all those trees are still living. We have a lot of vegetation in the ground level that's responded from fire. And here's me standing in that same stand. See here, here's a little baby oak right here, a little baby white oak. So after a fire, these white oaks really respond and new seedlings pop up, which helps them become the next generation of big trees. And so we talked about maybe why we need fire in some of these areas, but how do we get fire? How do we use fire in a way that's safe, in a way that's not going to be uncontrolled and turn into a wildfire? So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but here's a picture of myself and a lot of other people who use prescribed fire. And what we're wearing is fire resistant clothing. So we have these nice yellow shirts so that we're really visible. People can see us. This is fire resistant clothing. We also have a lot of tools here that we use, rakes to help control the fire. These are drip torches to help set the fire. But we want to do this, these prescribed fires, in as safe a way as possible. And so now I'm going to show you some videos of us using prescribed fire. Let's see here. Can we see that? So this is a fire that we used out at, a prescribed fire we used out at one of our research properties at Purdue. And as you can see, we have all of our people in yellow shirts and our fire resistant clothing. We also have a lot of vehicles, ATVs and UTVs around that have water with them to help make sure that this is the area we're burning. We don't want to get the fire in this area over here. So it's really controlled. We start really slowly. And this is some of that prairie vegetation that we were talking about that likes fire a lot. So it goes to show you that we're doing this in a safe way to create a healthy ecosystem, a healthy prairie ecosystem for all the plants and the wildlife that use these prairies. So you can see the fire there. It looks really big there, but it's all under control. It's staying inside the area that we want to burn and not getting in other areas. Speed this up a little bit. Now you can see we're burning this square right here. And we're not burning these others. So you may be asking yourself, well, how does wildlife survive in a fire like this? Well, if you're a bird, you can fly and you can get out of the fire. But a lot of wildlife species, like some of our mammals and things like that, even reptiles, can burrow into the ground and get away from the fire that way. So here's another cool video I wanted to show you. So that was a video looking from above at a fire. This is a video at the ground level of me burning a similar area at one of our research properties. And this is actually one of the ones that you may have seen on the Tippecanoe water quality website. This is the one that Ben and Monica saw us doing out there when we were burning that day. So you can see we're lighting the fire. There's my drip torch there. I have all my safety clothing on, all my safety gear, a helmet and everything. So we're doing this as safe as possible. We have equipment with water here to stop the fire from getting out. But we're lighting all this dead vegetation here. And after this burns, the whole site will be black and it'll be able to absorb more sunlight. And those prairie plants will come back from their root systems after this fire moves through. We see if we can maybe fast forward this a little bit.
How long, Jared, how long does it take for plants to regrow after fire for like a prairie plant like this?
Yeah, so a lot of it depends on what time of year you're burning. If you're burning in January or February, it may take until it warms up in May or June for the plants to respond. So maybe a couple months. But if you're burning, say, in April or May, it may only take a few weeks at most for those plants to respond.
Are there certain conditions you have to watch for when you burn?
Yeah, so we're looking to make sure this is safe, we want to make sure that the wind's not too strong and make sure that moisture in the air or the relative humidity is at a point where we can control the fire. So one more video before we end, and this is a good time-lapse video to show you how the vegetation responds after a fire. And so this is from Georgia. It's a really cool video.
No, I work here. Oh, okay. Down in the basement, building commission.
So there the fire goes through, turns the whole site black. That's all the ash. And as that fire burns through, it actually releases nutrients into the soil. You can see how quickly the grasses and shrubs and things respond after that fire. It's a really cool way to see what happens after a fire.
So you're telling us about all of the great things that fire can do. Who, and the difference between a wildfire and a prescribed fire, who should start a prescribed fire?
That's a really good question. So only those people that have a lot of training and expertise should be the ones that are starting prescribed fire. And so it took me a lot of experience and a lot of hours of training to be able to conduct prescribed fires safely. So there's different training courses and professionals that do this for a living. So really only those people should be the ones using prescribed fire, because we want to make sure it's safe, right? We don't want to burn a barn down or burn a house or anything. So we want to make sure that it's conducted as safely as possible so that we're not causing any harm to anybody.
Someone asked, sorry, Monica. Someone asked, what would happen if the fire gets out of hand and you can't stop it?
Yeah, so if the fire gets out of hand and we can't stop it, usually we have trucks with extra water on site. And a lot of times we have the fire department there with us. So if there's something that we can't control, that the fire department can control with their big equipment and things that they have that is beyond what we might have.
So how often will you go back and start that on fire again? How often do you have to do that?
Yeah, so with prairies, historically, prairies burned by two methods. The first method was lightning strikes. So lightning strikes would burn prairies, but also Native Americans. So Native Americans burned prairies for several different reasons. They burned prairies to create the vegetation that bison like to graze. They burned some forest areas to help those forests produce more berries that they could collect. They burn for a lot of different reasons, but prairies usually burn. We usually go back every 2 to 3, maybe 4 years and burn those sites because we want to keep some of the woody vegetation out.
Do you have any idea how many plant species are like benefited from wildfire? And are there plant species that are harmed by wildfire?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So the answer is a lot that are benefited from prescribed fire. And if you think about a prairie, there can be 200 or 300 species of plants that you can find in a prairie, in an acre of prairie. And there certainly are plants that don't benefit from fire, and we can use that to our advantage. So there's some invasive species that aren't from here that we can use fire to help control them. And we use fire to help control woody plants, some woody plants that may come into a prairie that we may not want. So there are plants that like fire, and there's plants that don't like fire.
Okay. What happens to any wildlife that's in a fire area or an area that you plan to burn?
Yeah, so a lot of that depends on what time of year it is. So if it's in the winter, a lot of the small wildlife species, especially things like reptiles, like box turtles, they're underground. They bury themselves underground. And so a fire can go over the site without harming box turtles that time of year because they're buried in the soil where it doesn't get very hot. Other wildlife like birds and things can fly away. Rabbits and such can run away. And then some of our smaller animals can seek refuge by burrowing or other things. But every now and then, some wildlife do die from fires, but not many of them.
Okay.
Do you have a specific size area you do each time, or is it just vary?
It varies. Those are small research plots. Those are about an acre in size, but out west and other places there, and even down in southern Indiana, they're burning hundreds of acres, even thousands of acres at a time.
Wow. So what got you into burning?
I've always enjoyed fire. And when I used to actually work at a fireworks store, so I've kind of always been interested in fire. And when I came to Purdue to be a wildlife major as an undergrad, I realized that there's a lot of positive benefits to using fire. And it was just really interesting to me and to see how things respond how things come back after you burn an area.
Jared, you showed pine cones opening to fire. Are there other ways to open pine cones, or do all pine cones require fire, or do some open on their own?
A lot of pine cones do open on their own. So there's only a select number of species that have those special cones that only open with fire. So like you've probably seen white pines. White pines is a pine that we have actually in this area west of here in Warren County. They don't need fire to open up. They open up themselves. But there's just certain pine species that only open with fire.
So here's a question for you. If you don't put it on fire, what would happen? Would the plants get out of hand?
Yeah, so if we take a prairie, if we don't burn a prairie, eventually that prairie will become a forest because woody plants will come in there, trees and shrubs and things like that, and it'll turn into a forest. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but there are certain wildlife species that need the prairie, that live in prairie. That's the habitat that they use. So if we don't burn it and allow that prairie to become a forest, then those animals have lost their home. Now that forest may be home for other wildlife species, but those species that really need the prairie have lost their home. And in the case of plants that have serotinous cones, like those pine trees. If we don't burn, then those trees won't reproduce. So the big ones will stay there, but there won't be any little seedlings.
And here's another question. I'm wondering how prehistoric species of plants responded to fire.
That's a really good question. So there's been some really interesting research looking into how long fires played a role in plants, and it goes back millions of years. They found some of these adaptations to fire. So some really old species are adapted to fire. So you would think, lightning's always been around, and so lightning's always started fires. Native Americans have started fires in North America for thousands of years. So a lot of plants have adapted over a long time to fire.
And
These are really good questions.
Does
are
anyone
there
have, does
other
anyone
ways?
have any last questions?
Here's some. Are there other ways? Whoops, I just lost it. Pine cones can open without fire.
Serotinous pine cones really need that really high heat, and it's heat that it's hotter than the temperature would get during the day, even in the summer. So it really has to happen with fire.
I think we answered that one. If life was there earlier, when the forest grows back, do the plants come back? Yes. How many times can a plant come back?
Lots of times. So, for instance, the vegetation that I showed you the picture of, that was the prairie vegetation. That was big blue stem, and so their big blue stem can be burned, every year, once a year, and it'll still come back.
So this seems to be kind of a popular one here. Has a fire ever spread where you didn't want it to go?
Oh, that's a really good question. So we've been fortunate in the ones that we've done that we've had what we call escapes. So when a fire gets out of the area that we don't want it to burn. So we've had that happen a few times, but it's been really small. So it may have burned an area the size of like a small pickup truck, rather than, getting out of hand. So we take a lot of safety precautions. We have a lot of people on site that have training, a lot of water and tools and things like that to make sure that that kind of stuff doesn't happen. And if it does, that we can stop it as quickly as possible.
I think you asked one. How many plant species respond to fire greatly?
Yeah.
I'm wondering.
Does fire pollute the air when you do prescribed burning or have natural wildfires? Does it cause air pollution?
Absolutely. So when these occur, wildfires, especially wildfires, they do put a lot of smoke into the air, which contains things like carbon dioxide and particulates and things like that. And so do prescribed fires. But relatively, compared to other sources of CO2 and things, it's really minuscule. Some of our bigger wildfires can create issues, but most of our prescribed fires are done at such a small scale that it's not really that much in the air.
Okay, maybe one more question and then we'll do a little wrap up.
I think has the fire ever spread? How many times come back? How long does it take to burn? Normally, that acre, how long did that take to burn?
So that acre takes us usually about between 45 minutes and an hour to burn an acre. Sometimes we can do it a little faster if we have more people and that kind of stuff.
Oh, here's one. How do you know they need fire?
Oh, so that's a really good question. So I showed you those pictures of some of the oak trees and then some of the pine cones, the serotinous pine cones. And so we look back through history using those fire scars in trees and using information from those serotinous cones to build kind of a history of how fire occurred on the landscape. And we can look and see how plants respond to fire. So in the case of serotinous cones, obviously they respond positively because they open the cones up and we have seed come out. So we know that way that those plants need fire. But we also know that looking back at historical ways that Native Americans burned and how some of our prairie vegetation responded positively, we can look through history and kind of determine how plants respond to fire.
There was another question in here I thought was good. Oh, so does fire, can you kill invasive species with fire?
Yes, you can. And we've used that on some of our properties as a way to help control invasives. It may not completely get rid of invasives, but it can help reduce their spread or make them more easy to control with other tools. So we use fire as a way to help us control invasive species.
Oh, very
But
good.
in some
Thank
cases,
you.
it may not. So.
Okay. So I'm going to ask you the one question that we're going to ask all of our presenters for this conservation live event.
I didn't see
What is
this
one thing you wish everyone in the world knew about wildfire or wildlife habitat in general?
Okay. Well, I think that goes back to the question that I posed on the flyer, right? So is there such thing as a good fire? And so I would hope that everyone would understand that there are good fires, there are beneficial fires that help create healthy ecosystems and help protect some of the really important ecosystems we have in North America and across the world, so that people would understand that, you know, certainly wildfires are bad, especially if they can damage people's homes or harm people. But there's a lot of fire that can be beneficial, that can help provide those healthy ecosystems. So there is such thing as a good fire, and it's ones that are controlled and prescribed and done by professionals.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Jared, for joining us. Everyone in your own homes, give Jared a little round of applause. No one will be able to hear you, but
Yeah, I'm coming to you live from my kitchen. So
yes, thank you very much for joining us, Jared. I want to let everyone know that we have another one of these coming up at 1 p.m. Eastern today. We'll be learning about the Hellbender Salamander, which I don't want to give too much away, but it can grow to 2 feet long. So you'll want to come and join us again for that. Here is the flyer for that one in case you don't have access to the Zoom link yet. Write it down or copy and paste it off of the screen, or take a screenshot, or do whatever you need to do. We'll have Shelby Royal from Purdue University telling us about Hellbenders. So with that, I think we're going to shut this one down, and we'll hope to see everyone at 1 o'clock. Thanks again, Jared.
thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Good to see you, Jared.
Yep. Bye,
You too.
guys.